And so we're going to start off with a little bit of a pop quiz. So I told the panelists right before we came out, I said, guys, I didn't tell you, but we're going to do a pop quiz. Get ready. And they were like, what is it? So they don't know. But the good news is it's for them, and it's for all of you, okay? So here is the question. Do you think artificial intelligence is mostly like, you're going to have 5 options, and you're going to vote. So think about it as we go. Number 1, cryptocurrency. Mostly a scam, maybe has some edge use cases. Number 2, self-driving cars. Likely to be a big thing when they finally enter the world. We have no idea when that might be. Number 3, the internet. Completely changes how we work, how we live. Number 4, fire. Completely changes our trajectory as a species. Or number 5, aliens. We have never seen anything like this before. So, we're going to do a little bit of the raising of the hands, and I'm going to invite the panelists and those in the audience to raise in tandem. So, who thinks it's mostly like 1, cryptocurrency, mostly a scam, but maybe with some use cases? Ooh, nobody. All right. I'm a little surprised. Okay, number 2. Oh, there are a couple. All right, thank you. Let's have the courage of our convictions. There we go. Yeah. All right, we got a few. What about 2, self-driving cars? A few more. All right, very 1. The internet completely changes how we work and live. Yeah, that seems like it's going to be the modal option here. But let's see, fire. Okay? 2, 3 people, maybe just as much for that as crypto. And what about aliens? I know none of these guys are going to say aliens, but nobody. Okay, so it seems like the sense of this room, at least, is that we are facing a challenge similar to the internet in the scope of what we're talking about. And well, we are here to talk about AI and specifically anti-monopoly and industrial organization. So to kick us off, I want to go to you, Elizabeth. This is a big week. The White House, for those of you who don't know, put out a groundbreaking executive order on Monday. And rather than my trying to summarize it, can you, of course, tell us what's in it, but maybe before you even just jump into that, tell us a little bit of the story of how it came about.
Absolutely. Thanks, Chris, and thanks so much to Economic Security Project for having us here today. I think the story is pretty straightforward. This is something the administration has been focused on for quite some time. You saw it in the AI Bill of Rights that came out last year. You saw it in the NIST risk management framework. We've been thinking about how do you grapple with the changes that brings, how do you protect people in the here and now, and how do you harness AI for good. And things really got kicked into high gear with the advent of ChatGPT in March.
Right.
Went from being something that I think a handful of folks in industry were talking about to the fastest growing consumer app of all time.
Right.
And I think that the White House and the entire administration likewise kicked their efforts into really high gear. We saw just a couple of weeks after that happen, the president gathering the CEOs of the sort of frontier large language models together to talk about what they were going to do to mitigate the risk.
Nearly overnight. I mean, had you all been tracking this before ChatGPT?
Yeah, I think the fact that there were meetings with the president, there was this sort of whole of government push through Office of Science and Technology Policy on the Bill of Rights. There was
yeah, the Bill of Rights came out 2 years ago, right, or something like that?
It was last July of
okay.
But yeah, like it's still like a pretty steady
well before
drumbeat
ChatGPT,
here.
yeah.
And I'd say it's just like everyone, it's kicked their efforts into high gear in the same way that you've seen with allies and partners.
For sure, right.
EU and their AI Act, the G7 and their Code of Conduct, so lots of things happening.
So what's actually in the EO? It is big, I know. So you don't have to take us through every. What are the things that you want us to take home to the, or when we go to the cocktail hour? What are the big notes in the EO?
Yeah, don't worry. The EO is either 88 pages if printed on legal, or 111 if printed on normal 8.5 by 11. Okay. So I will spare you all of that. That's a good way to get a post-lunch coma. But a couple things I'd say. One is I think that we followed the president's directive to use every single lever at our disposal. It is so long because it was really a whole of government effort. Every cabinet secretary, every independent agency involved in thinking about how can we use our authorities to protect Americans against the risks and harness its potential. And that's why it's such a long document. There are things that have gotten a fair amount of press in it. For example, some of the more national security components around requiring companies to report the results of their red teaming, or efforts to make sure that there are clear standards for watermarking AI content, and the federal government uses it for any content it produces. But given today's audience, I want to hit on a couple of key themes, namely sort of innovation and competition provisions, the steps that we're taking to protect people in the here and now from what's happening on the ground as opposed to the more existential risks, and how we as a government are thinking about our use of AI. I do think there is a lot on the competition innovation side. So in addition to a fair amount of money for R&D, especially in new cases like healthcare, climate, where we know there are going to be positive applications, there are efforts to really try and democratize the AI ecosystem. We know right now this is a space that is controlled by a handful of large tech incumbents. And one of the key sort of flagship proposals of the EO is doing a pilot of the National AI Resource Research. I can never say it right. It's the NARE. But basically, $140 million from NSF devoted to providing access to data and to compute for academics, for entrepreneurs, just trying to catalyze innovation across the ecosystem. Now, $140 million is not as much as this problem demands. That's why there's a proposal in Congress. But we think it's a really important first step. And likewise, there's efforts by the SBA, NSF, to make sure that there is additional funding for small businesses, for entrepreneurs, and the technical assistance they need to be part of this innovation.
So that 140 million, that's for researchers mostly at universities or in the public sector to explore ways to use AI for public good, or is it to set up new infrastructure that then could be leveraged downstream? What is that? What is that actually
It's
for?
more about paying for, and you should chime in here because I know you've written extensively about the NARE and both what it should be as well as what is its actuality. But making sure that they have access to the data, the compute, the things that are currently too cost prohibitive and are not available.
Ah, okay. Guaranteeing access.
Exactly.
So before we go to you, Ganesh, I want, Sarah, can you just speak to the question of corporate power here? There's so many conversations happening about AI in the world. Today's is really about how we should think about corporate power, anti-monopoly, and the challenges of artificial intelligence. And I know you've spent a lot of time thinking about that and working on that. So can you help set that scene for us?
Yeah. So I would almost start from the place where, what we're talking about with artificial intelligence is itself a product of concentrated power in the tech industry. AI, as we understand it today, now remember, AI has meant many different things over the course of an almost 70-year history, but today we're talking about statistical techniques applied to large pools of data that's either scraped from the web or culled through commercial surveillance. And then, we use computational infrastructure to, apply the techniques to the data. All of those resources needed to build this version of AI are monopolized by a small handful of firms. And the incentive structures to build AI in this way are also set by those same firms. So I think, one answer to the question is to see concentration in AI as a feature, not a bug. But we can also flip that on its head and look at the ways that AI is being deployed in the world in ways that concentrates power. AI is frequently used by folks who are in power on those who are relatively less powerful. You can look to, the use of AI to make determinations about allocation of benefits. The state of Michigan, for example, got in a lot of trouble because of a use of an automated decision-making system that was denying tens of thousands of people access to their state-mandated benefits. You could look to worker surveillance, for example, as AI as a way to sort of reassert control over workers. all of these are reasons why anti-monopoly is such a critical leverage point, because it acknowledges that there are, detrimental effects for small d democracy when you have that level of concentrated economic power in just a few firms.
So Ganesh, I want to bring you in. When we're talking about anti-monopoly and AI, can you help us understand how to think about the different components of AI, the chips, the models, and then what role does competition policy play? Ganesh has had several really pioneering papers, for those of you who haven't seen them, through the Vanderbilt Policy Accelerator that map out, quite literally, diagram out the ecosystem. So I'd love it if you could just take us through some of that.
Yeah, so let me just start by also not quite a quiz, but a question for everyone in the audience. How many people have tried ChatGPT in some iteration?
Yeah, just about everybody.
A lot of people have tried it. So when you engage with ChatGPT, that's an application. But for that application to work, it has to rely on a model. And so if you've heard about OpenAI, they're the folks who make that model. It's called a foundation model because it is foundational to potentially a lot of different kinds of applications. The model relies, as Sarah mentioned, on a lot of data, and that's how you apply the model to something in order to produce what's in the application. Below that, for the model to work, you have to use a lot of computing power. And so the way that operates is you can't really have that work at scale on your own computer or on your iPhone or something like that. So you're using cloud services, and that provides the compute power. Where the cloud services get the compute power is from semiconductors, or chips, as they're often called. And those chips themselves have to get designed and made. And as you move down this funnel from applications all the way down to the machines that make the chips, there's actually more and more concentration at each of these layers. So you could imagine having a lot of application providers, but there's a smaller number of models. There's some number of models, but actually there's only 3 big cloud providers. Sure, there's 3 big cloud providers, but when it comes to designing chips, there's really only a couple that can do the really most advanced chips, and NVIDIA is really the main company there.
Right.
And if you want to make those chips, Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company are the main people who do that.
Right.
Maybe there's one other, but at the really high end, they're the main player. And there's literally only one company that can actually make the machines that are used to make the semiconductors. It's a Dutch company. So you have like a literal monopoly at the bottom of this supply chain, and then kind of slow growing oligopoly as you go up, and eventually maybe there's more of a competitive market. And so I think what we should be worried about is that in a bunch of these layers in the supply chain, or the AI tech stack, as people in the industry call it, there's real concentration. And with concentration, you get all the downsides of concentration. You have monopolies. They might have higher prices and lower quality service. They might try to preference their own vertically integrated businesses over other competitors. They might foreclose competition or limit who has access to their resources. And the challenge here, if you just take, for example, the cloud layer, which a lot of this depends on to be able to do it at scale,
All of it,
is
really,
there's
yeah.
3 companies, the big ones that could really do this at scale: Microsoft, Google, Amazon. You may have heard of those companies. And if you think about it, all 3 of those companies, either right now or in the past, have had major antitrust actions be brought against them for anti-competitive behaviors of self-preferencing and lots of other types of harms. And the other part is those same companies are also either operating at other layers of the stack or seeking to do so. So they're either moving into foundation models by investing in firms in those places. They make their own applications. If you're Microsoft, you have Bing, you have your search engine. You also have Microsoft Office, which is a different kind of product that could have AI integrated into it. You have an investment in OpenAI, which does the foundation models, right? So when you see this vertical integration across the stack, it should really worry us, because the history of industry shows that concentration at these layers, where it's an essential infrastructure or an essential utility for lots of other kinds of activities, often leads to abuses of power. And that the way we address that in areas where real competition is highly unlikely because of high costs and the need for scale is through some kind of regulation. And so I think part of what we need to be thinking about in this conversation is how do we actually ensure that at these layers that are super concentrated, that we have regulations to ensure we have a system that overall isn't just going to be vertically monopolized also?
Right. So before we get to solutions, this is a question really for all three of you, so jump in, whoever has the first thoughts. What do you say to the folks who say, AI is really different than, than many other industries and many other companies, even on the web, because of the really significant capital costs that go into the cloud development, for instance, or just to fabricate the chips at the bottom of the pyramid that you were, or maybe it's not a pyramid, but at the bottom of the ecosystem that you were describing, Ganesh. This is a kind of industry that actually looks more like railroads, where you have to have incredibly large amounts of money to invest, and there are likely only going to be a few major providers. So in that world, shouldn't we just be clear-eyed and say we want a managed oligopoly that is well regulated, rather than expecting sort of pure neoclassical market competition to be the kind of disciplining agent? What do you say to folks who might go there?
Do you want me to?
Sure, if you want to lead us off, Ganesh, and then I'm sure.
So I think that at some of the layers in the stack, that a kind of regulated system is going to be the right answer. And because we shouldn't expect, and the key thing about the railroads or your electric company is that we regulate them. We don't think we should have competition in electricity coming to your house, because we don't want 20 electric wires coming to your front yard to your house. It would just be a total mess. We want one. But when you have one, you have a monopoly, and they're going to abuse their power, and so we regulate them. And so I think that is, to me, the right answer at some of these layers where we're unlikely to get real competition, probably have an oligopoly.
Right.
But at other layers where there is competition, applications, for example, we can imagine a world with lots of application developers. In those places, we may not need that. And so that's why I think the framework of working through the stack is helpful, because it asks us to look at what's really the industrial organization and structure at each layer of business. So that would be my answer.
What do you all think? Do we just want, is it fine to have 3 cloud computing options as long as they're well regulated?
I mean, what really worries me about this market is what we're seeing from the major players is what other competition scholars have described as toxic competition, where companies that have both an ecosystem advantage, they have these sprawling platform ecosystems that stretch across different sectors, and they also have infrastructure ownership, are acting in ways where they're pushing models and products out onto the market before they're ready, where they themselves will, Google will go to the Wall Street Journal and tell a reporter, about its MedPalm, which is a medical chatbot that it released. I wouldn't want this to be part of my own family's healthcare journey, but they're testing it in hospital settings. So I think that the fact that we're seeing these incumbents move so swiftly, enact code reds to try and retain their first mover advantage is really worrisome. And the incentive structures of both those sprawling horizontal ownership structures and their ownership of infrastructure, I think mandates some kind of structural solution in this market, which I think would work very much in tandem with some of the things that Ganesh is talking about.
But you could have 100 startups rushing too fast to bring dangerous products to market. Or you could have 3. I mean, how does concentration affect the nature of unregulated, the potential to introduce unregulated products into markets, creating damage?
Well, as a rule, right now, if you're a startup looking to enter this market, you have to have some kind of contractual arrangement with one of these big firms. You just can't be able to make any movement in the market. So I would think about the startup ecosystem more as like barnacles on the hull of big tech, rather than its sort of own set of entities.
I think it also goes to the distribution question. If you're one of the big companies and have lots of other sort of subsidiaries, it's a lot easier to push your application into the market very quickly than a small startup with a limited marketing budget. So there's sort of a lot more follow-on effects. I really like your way of sort of thinking about the stack and what is the right regulation, legislation approach at different parts of the stack, because I do think that it demands different solutions, right? Obviously, we have the CHIPS Act to try and increase production of chips, but it's a huge, huge question, especially given the NVIDIA TMC monopoly on the GPUs at present. I think there's an open question of to what extent we see the development of open source such that there is less data, less compute power needed to produce pretty strong LLM models. I think from our perspective, a lot of our tools that we're bringing to bear at the more application level, and thinking about our sort of power of the purse through procurement. Not to sort of toot our own horn, but I think it's noteworthy that when we put out the EO and the M memo, we directed that government procurement of AI should look at competition and make sure that we were not entrenching incumbents or encouraging behavior like self-preferencing, making sure there was interoperability. So again, it goes back to your different solutions for different part of the stack.
So it sounds like managed oligopoly might be a solution in some of these places in the stack. In other places, aspiring for a more competitive market might be the appropriate solution. So let's talk a little bit about what we can do. I work in anti-monopoly, and people always think that's just shorthand for breakup. All you want to do is go around breaking up big companies. So as I often tell them, actually it's about leveraging all kinds of legal and regulatory traditions to ensure markets are competitive and fair. So let's talk about what some of those traditions are and how they would apply here in AI. Because breakup may be, I'm curious, if that is one of the tools that you think we should be wielding. But what's on the menu of what we as activists, thinkers, organizers, journalists, funders could be thinking about to do, what tools can we bring to bear to rein in some of the concentrated corporate power in the AI sector?
So I think one answer that isn't pinned solely on antitrust intervention is actually data minimization. Data minimization.
Okay.
So if you're going to build AI, you have to have massive amounts of data, right? And data quality is a really important differentiating factor in this market, and the data comes from us. It's coming from society, whether it's things that we're posting on the web or things that companies are harvesting about us. Now, if you make interventions that reduce the plane of data that can be pulled from consumers, that's a meaningful curb on firms' power. And I think in the White House executive order, some of the messaging around that really foregrounded the U.S. doesn't have a federal data privacy law. In the EU, regulators were able to move very swiftly and actually enact temporary bans on ChatGPT under the General Data Protection Regulation. It was data privacy that was actually the swiftest leverage point to curb some of the behavior of these firms, and I think it's an important part to keep in the toolkit.
I would totally agree with that. I talked about protecting consumers being one of the key themes of the EO, and I think the fact that one of the sections is focused on privacy speaks to how essential this is. Not only does AI feed on data, which creates even more incentives for our data to be sold and commoditized, but in addition, it makes it possible to link seemingly disparate pieces of information in ways that you're having a much more holistic, damaging to privacy view of someone. And so I think it's noteworthy that one piece of the legislation the president called for coming out of the EO was comprehensive federal privacy legislation. It is more important now than ever with AI. And we've seen some really positive regulatory steps between what the CFPB has done with data brokers, the FTC action, but we have more to do, and we can have a longer conversation about what the Europeans are doing here.
I think I understand what you all mean, but can we just get one more beat? What's the harm that we're worried about? Because my sense is like a lot of us see ChatGPT, like reading Wikipedia and all the books in the world and this and that. But so what's the harm that you're concerned about when it comes to privacy and AI?
I can give an example. The FTC had a case a few months ago against Amazon for its Alexa device, where in that case, the FTC found that Amazon was indefinitely retaining the voice prints of children under the justification that they wanted to improve their AI models. And the FTC said, sorry, that violates our COPPA, the Children's Online Privacy Act. This is not an acceptable acceptable justification. So these secondary use cases, I think, are one of the things that we need to worry about, that firms are incentivized to just hold on to everything forever, just so that they can keep improving their AI models.
Yeah. Ganesh, what are some of the other tools?
So I think there's a couple more that I'll throw that I would characterize as public utility and public option kind of tools. So the first one is structural separations. And this, Chris, is to your point, actually—
Is that breakup?
Breaking up,
All right.
right? But it's not breaking up in the sense of, and I think we both heard people say this, whenever you talk about breakups, people would ask things like in the tech context, like, well, does that mean you want like a southern Facebook and a West Coast Facebook and a New England Facebook? And it doesn't make any sense, right? You can't do that. No, what breakups mean in this, or structural separations mean, is the different layers of the stack should be separated. So if you're a cloud company, you shouldn't also own the foundation models and the application companies, because if you do, what's likely to happen is you're going to preference your own foundation model over a different one, or your own applications over a different one. And if cloud is basically the electricity of all of this, we want the electricity to be available to lots of different people and not just to the same company that provides it.
So just to make sure I understand this, so Microsoft would be forbidden from owning OpenAI.
Microsoft couldn't—
In one scenario.
Right, and there's different ways you could design that. Throughout our history, actually the most common thing was in a lot of statutes, what they would say is, if you are involved in this business line, you can't own any shares or any component of any other business in in that industry.
But so in this case, Meta has a cloud, Meta has a large language, has an LLM, and has some cloud, so they would not be able to, like, how would you?
So I think one way you'd think about it is, at each of these layers, you'd say, if you're going to be a semiconductor manufacturer, you also can't, own cloud. If you're going to be a cloud provider, you also can't have foundation models, right? And it's in the places where you're worried about that concentration. So that's one. Two is a non-discrimination rule. And this is, again, a very old rule, been around since the Middle Ages. And the idea here is you have to serve everybody on equal terms with equal prices. And so there you say, if you're a cloud provider, for example, you can't charge different prices to different companies that want to use your cloud services, because not just because you might own them or not, right? Structural separation helps solve that problem. But we don't like you, or we actually think there's a benefit to supporting this company over the other one for some other business purposes of ours, or any number of other things. We just want a transparent level playing field for using these utility services so that anyone can have access to them. So that's another tool. And then the third one, and this also cuts to the managed oligopoly question, is a public option. And so again, in cloud, you could say what we maybe want is not just to have Google, Amazon, and Microsoft, but maybe there is a public option for cloud, a government funded, provided infrastructure resource. And so I think one of the questions for the NAIR in the legislation is it actually just a contract, for example, with Amazon to provide resources to researchers in cloud access? Or is there actually going to be like a federal supercomputer? And we've had federal supercomputers in the past, and people really liked them. They worked really well. Researchers did exciting things on them. We could have a resource like that, and one of the benefits is it's not tied to the financial interests or priorities of the companies, especially if there's scarcity around cloud provision, for example.
So why wasn't something like that in the EO? Is it on us on the outside to work a little bit harder to help you all be able to do that, or is it actually politically too hard? A public option for AI specifically.
Sure. So I guess what I'd say is that this was about using our existing tools and authorities and existing resources.
Right.
A public option for cloud is going to cost a lot more than $140 million. And so I think this is a question for Congress, part of the conversation of what does the comprehensive AI legislation that Leader Schumer and others have been talking about look like.
Got it. So we would need Congress to act on something that big. So let's just talk a little bit more about that, because I know I was talking in the hallway. There are a lot of people here who are interested in public options. Ganesh, you have literally written a book. I think the title is, isn't it Public Options? And The Public Option, right. I thought so. Okay, so talk to us a little bit collectively about, again, I want to be, what problem is, a public option for AI sounds like it is a government-funded and controlled cloud that entrepreneurs and researchers and many other people could use. What problem, why do we need this? What problem is this solving? Yeah, if you could start, but then I want to bring in other voices, yeah.
So I think there's a couple ways to look at this. So one is a question of competition. So we're talking about anti-monopoly strategies. Competition is one option. Are you locked into one of the big providers, which might have either abusive policies, high costs, preferencing other kinds of activities, throttling of certain services or scarcity, and so they're not providing what you need. So that's one. Maybe you want competition to discipline the marketplace in an oligopoly market. A second is access. We want to have access to a wider set of people than might be able to have access under the private cloud system.
Right.
And so that's a second possibility for a public option. When we were hearing Brad Lander earlier talk about this in the water context, this is the Aaron Burr problem, right? Instead of that, let's have public water access, which is available to everyone, including people who don't want to buy bottles of water. They can use New York City's tap water, right? So that's the other example. And researchers, government. I think there's a third possibility here too, which is in some cases you might not want to be locked in and have so much government dependence on the power of one or a few companies.
Right.
And so if you think about the balance of power between public actors like the government and private corporations, you might say we should actually have some ability to have some resources be independent because we're worried that if we're too dependent, that power could get leveraged from the private sector into other kinds of things in the government as well.
Got it. And Sarah, you were recently at the FTC. Are people in government talking about, not just public options, yes, but all of this structural separation, de-anonymization, non-discrimination, a lot of these solutions? What's sort of the state, to the extent that you can talk about just what is publicly available.
Yeah.
But what's sort of the state of the conversation amongst the competition authorities in Washington and AI in particular?
Yeah, I think that the FTC has done a lot of public signaling on this front, and the chair, I think in particular, has been front and center in saying that one, there's no AI exemption to the laws on the books.
Right.
We need to be enforcing the laws that we have. Companies need to be ensuring that they're complying with the laws already on the books before they're putting their products out into market. I think they've also raised concerns that these are moments when you have these moments of profound technological transformation, that incumbents have a tendency historically to act in ways that seek to preserve their advantage. And so we need to be, on the front foot in, looking to, looking out for that kind of anti-competitive behavior. I'll also say that, competition authorities all around the world have been paying attention to these issues. I can think of 6 different examples where enforcement agencies have conducted studies into the cloud. The UK just referred a complaint about concentration in cloud over to the Competition and Markets Authority. So I think there's convergence on some of the basic problems. Now that's no substitute for strong action, and that's, I think, what we need to really be looking to next is, what does it look like to have effective and strong enforcement measures? And
do we need Congress to do that? It's a little bit to what Elizabeth was saying, certainly for funding any kind of public option, but where's Congress in this?
So I'll start and then you should jump in. I think it is noteworthy that this executive order not only encouraged the FTC to continue using its authorities to promote competition in this marketplace, but actually said that every federal agency needs to think about competition in how it is either regulating, enforcing AI more generally. And I think part of that is making sure that we have sophisticated people in government. Part of what we're trying to do is really have an AI talent surge, so that you have people in seats who can bring enforcement actions. You have technologists who actually understand what's at the root of it. Now you can do more of that with funding and appropriations, but I think it's a good step forward.
You have that amazing website, just to give a plug, is it AI, the talent surge is a real, can you speak for maybe one more minute on what is the talent surge? It feels like it's like government trying to move fast and get the smartest people in the door.
Yeah, I think we recognize there is a talent race here. I mean,
Yeah.
every government in the world needs smart people in AI who are willing to come and serve the public good.
Yeah.
And shape not only our own use and deployment of AI, but also our regulation and enforcement of it in the ecosystem more broadly. And so there's a lot of work in sort of how do we leverage the US Digital Service, Presidential Innovation Fellowships, the sort of existing pathways that we do have, streamline getting people in the door, open up additional spots, be creative about the types of people that we need, and we can do a lot more with Congress.
Yeah.
But I think the EOB takes a pretty meaningful step forward.
For sure. So how quickly do we need to move here is sort of a foundational question. I mean, there are some who would want us to be moving even faster, developing congressional legislation, pushing the existing antitrust authorities to do more, other agencies across the government. There are others who might say, okay, let's take this AI, it could be important, but we don't need to rush. Let's go slower and get it right. Where do you all fall on the timeliness of the challenge?
So I think there's no reason to wait. And often you hear people say things like, well, the technology is just moving so fast.
Right, yeah.
So we
people say that all
can't
the time.
do anything now. But nothing I said about how the stack is organized or the types of harms we would see at many of these levels is actually dependent on how good ChatGPT is,
Yeah.
or how accurate it is, or how fast that technology is moving. In fact, all of that is basically fixed, and we know about this. We know how it's going to work, and so a lot of things I think we can address right away. And so there's no need, I think, to wait for that. And in fact, there's a danger on the other side of waiting, which is you get so much entrenchment by the existing entities that become more powerful that then it becomes harder in the political sphere to do anything because they have more power and more ability to lobby Congress and get their will in the process. So I think there's a value to moving fast rather than slow for those reasons.
It feels like it's the perennial argument of a lot of folks is that because Congress is not sophisticated, they don't know what they're doing, so we can't let them move too fast to regulate because it's going to shut down industry, it's going to shut down innovation, or even have geopolitical implications. But my sense on the Hill is that people want to move somewhat fast, and they're unusually committed to learning. I mean, you hear these stories of these, I haven't been to them, but the gatherings that Schumer is doing in the Senate, and all of these senators come and they stay for a couple hours trying to get smart fast. Is it your sense that legislators are genuinely, no, I mean, they're trying to get smart on it as quickly? That's different. That certainly wasn't happening with social media 15 years ago or 20 years ago. Is that your sense? Is that a real thing? And do you think that bodes well for a regulatory landscape over the next couple years? Sarah?
My sense is that it's real, and that the work, you can track this work back for years. Congress has had bills that would deal with AI on the table, in the previous Congress and the Congress before that. We're not building from a blank slate here, and I think that's really important to keep in frame, particularly when the narrative that we are, ensures that we're continually trying to push the same ball up the same hill. Like, we have decades worth of evidence on the industry writ large, and also specifically on some of these problems as they've been taking shape within AI. I think what's changed about this moment, the reason that it's getting so much attention, is that with the shift to generative AI, there's an interface. It's now intuitive. It's not this sort of invisible set of infrastructures used on us. It's something that we can engage with, and that, more than anything else, I think has changed the tenor of the conversation. But certainly in terms of, regulatory movement, there's a lot to be building from already, and a lot of expertise already within Congress and across government to draw on here.
So we have a sense of where we can go. So we have time just for a couple last questions. One is I want to talk a little aspirationally about how government can use AI to do its work better. I'm often struck by how we're often talking about regulating AI in the private sector and creating more competitive markets. But can AI help the IRS process a lot of tax returns and/or flag the ones that may need auditing it? Could it help the FTC go through the countless mergers that occur in the United States to actually assess the ones that it wants to spend more time investigating? I mean, I could imagine a million different places where implementing AI could help government do government better. I mean, did you all give some thought? I don't think that was part of the EO, but have you all given some thought to that?
So it wasn't part of the EO only because the EO directed the Office of Management and Budget to issue guidance on terms of how the government could use AI.
Elsewhere, okay.
And that came out on Wednesday.
Okay, well, tell us about that.
No, I think to your point, like federal agencies identified 700 plus use cases of how they could responsibly deploy AI to improve the services that they're providing and what they're doing on behalf of the American public. And to your point, this is not new. There's already been many positive use cases in the federal government. For example, HHS using it for predictions around pandemic preparedness, looking at supply chains, other agencies using it for weather forecasting. So we already know that there are really positive use cases that we can use within government. And I think it's incumbent on us to both get the talent and the resources within government to take advantage of those and create the structure so that we are doing it responsibly. Mm-hmm. So one of the things this document does is it looks at removing barriers to your more basic applications of AI, for example, back-end processing and the examples that you gave, versus making sure there's really robust safeguards when you're talking about use of AI in ways that impact people's rights. So if it's benefit determinations or other things where we know there's huge things at stake.
That makes sense.
Can I pull together a couple threads with that? So I think one thing that's important on the use cases and the hiring up of people, as Elizabeth mentioned, and connects to anti-monopoly too here and public options, is really having a big, robust set of technologists who are in government who know how to do this. Also means you don't have to rely on the companies themselves or consultants for the companies to provide those same services. And so in a paper that we've recently put out, Ramsey, Ayer, and I, one of our analysts at VPA, make this point that actually a number of the consulting firms that are offering AI and types of services to government are actually partnered up with the same big companies in tech that we've talked about, your Googles, your Amazons. And so there's a worry that unless we build this kind of public capacity, we think partly what we'll end up with is a lot of this work being outsourced back to the same companies, right, which goes back to our anti-monopoly problem.
Right, absolutely.
And I think it's really important that we proceed here from the question of what is the problem that we're trying to solve in the first place, and is AI the right tool from the task? Start from the question of whether AI rather than the assumption of we're going to just sort of fit AI into everything and let's figure out how to make it as responsible as possible. I think this is a moment, if there was a place for pause, it's there. It's sort of starting with taking a step back and asking why AI in the first place. And to your point, Chris, I think articulating a set of productive principles around what it means for AI to serve the interests of the public, not just of the industry.
Absolutely. So let's, as a closeout question, I'll ask each of you to weigh in. What might the world look like in 5 years or 10 years if we get this right? If we actually apply the tools of anti-monopoly in a way that creates the right kind of balance of competition that serves the public good, as you so artfully were just saying, Sarah, what might that world feel like? What might it look like? Why don't we start with you, Sarah, and then we'll close out with Ganesh.
I would love to live in a world, one where we're actually not putting AI at the center of the conversation, but where AI is a tool that serves another set of societal goals and principles. And by virtue of that, we're talking about building AI differently, because the kind of AI that we're building right now is tremendously environmentally costly. It carries all of these, harmful effects in ramping up societal inequality. There are all of these sort of off gases of building AI at scale that have societal detriments. And if we can change the incentive structures through anti-monopoly, I think then we can get closer to re-articulating AI in a way that, actually meaningfully serves, all of our interests rather than just those of the industry.
Elizabeth?
Tough act to follow, but I think just one thing that I would double click on is right now with AI in just a couple of hands, there are sort of existing business lines and existing revenue streams that AI helps maximize. And to the extent that you're democratizing AI and making sure that more entrepreneurs, more academics, more researchers are able to have access to the tools they need, I'm optimistic that they can be used to solve more of the sort of public problems that we wanted to tackle. That one of the subtitles of this panel is building AI for the public good. And I think a more robust ecosystem means more attention on using AI for weather forecasting, for drug discovery, and all of the other things that we want to see happen.
I won't add much because I think both of those answers were terrific, and I think that's exactly right. We see a world in which these tools are used appropriately and to actually make a lot of things better for the things we really care about.
Amazing. Ganesh, Elizabeth, Sarah, thank you. This was fascinating.
Thank you so much.